Being a marketer's no sweat. You just have to manage dozens of channels, launch hundreds of campaigns, score thousands of leads, and okay, fine, it's a lot of sweat. Unless you have HubSpot's AI-powered marketing tools to help you do all that and more. Get started at HubSpot.com/marketers.
Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadline so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Welcome to the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Guggenheim. We're doing the mid-season review, everybody. It's mid-season. It's crazy. This season's flying by. Make sure to like, subscribe wherever you get your podcast, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Let's get this thing up to 300 subscribers. Let's get this thing out there, folks. Appreciate y'all. We're going to get right into it. I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about some comments I got on the last pod. There is a little bit of agita coming out because I said the SEC stinks. Both on this show and on the Big Ten Huddle. There's one commenter that asked, isn't this a Big Ten show? Stick to the Big Ten. Had another commenter saying the SEC stinks. No, you stink. Look at the records. I'm just going to address that real quick. So first of all, to the lovely listener who asked, why are you covering the SEC? This is a Big Ten show. Context. Because the reality is the Big Ten has always been looked at within the realm of where are they in the pecking order of all the power conferences. And especially now, when you look at the scope of college football, there are two power conferences, like two super conferences in the SEC and the Big Ten. And so I think rightly am always concerned about where is the Big Ten in context to the SEC. And there is reality, which I don't think they're actually that far apart. And then there's the bias that's inherent in the media, which has often skewed in the direction of the SEC. And I think we were seeing that once more, saying Georgia, Alabama was the best game between the two best teams in the country. Spoiler alert, they're not, at least not right now. Now they could be, but the reality is the Big Ten is never in a vacuum. Much like, and I'll talk about this a little bit as we talk about the review, Ohio State losing to Oregon is not in a vacuum. Because if it were in a vacuum, you know what you say about Ohio State? That's a tough loss to a really good team. Maybe the best team in the country at home or in their home place. So in a vacuum, it's like, yeah, but there's context, right? There's context. We know about Ryan Day. We know about Jim Knowles. We know about some of the big game failures. So you got to evaluate it in the context of other data. And that's why, if I'm honest, one of the best things for the Big Ten was to see Tennessee lose to Arkansas, to see Alabama lose to Vandy and then struggle against South Carolina, to see Georgia struggle a little bit with Mississippi State and Auburn. It's helpful because it helps us recognize when maybe there's some media bias that's inflating the SEC and downplaying the Big Ten. And there are financial reasons to do that, especially from a certain four-letter network. That's why. To the person who said, look at the records, the SEC doesn't stink, you stink. Whatever, dude. Like, you clearly didn't understand the point of the episode. So, do I actually think the SEC stinks? No. Do I think Alabama and Georgia would struggle a bit with the top 3 or 4 teams in the Big Ten? Yeah. I think Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, like, I think you can make a case for Iowa against a couple of those teams, and Michigan, if Tuttle works out for them. I think on the right day, I think Washington and USC could give them a run. We saw USC beat LSU, who right now is seen as an SEC contender. So I think it's important to set that up and say, listen, if we're going to sit here and pander to the SEC and say they should have 6 playoff teams, the Big Ten has to counter that and say, I don't think you're that good. And it's not saying that they're not good at all. It's not saying that they're a one-team league in the playoff. It's saying, listen, you're not so dominant that you should get 6, 5, 6, maybe even 7 teams in the playoff. You should probably get 3 or 4, maybe a 5th. But it sure as heck shouldn't be 6, and it probably shouldn't be 5. That's why it's important. So do they actually stink? No. Is Alabama and Georgia probably going to get into the playoff? At least one of them will. But it's important to set the context and to call out blatant media bias when, honestly, the Georgia-Alabama game, it was exciting, but it was bad football on both sides. And when we start saying, well, those are the 2 best teams in the country, then you start to skew in a way that is unhelpful and unhealthy. So that's why I did it. If you think I still stink, fine. That's your prerogative. Drop my handy dandy sheet here. I want to briefly get to last weekend, and I want to share you briefly my picks, because what I'm going to do, I'm not going to do full breakdowns. Like I said, this is a midseason review, but I do want to give you a little bit of what I cover with JR on the Big Ten Huddle, just in case you missed that. I'm just going to pick out particularly 3, I was going to say 2, but 3 things. One is that I think the Ohio State-Oregon game is the game of the year. That was not Alabama-Georgia. That was good on good, with good teams exploiting one another at times and catching Ohio State flat-footed a couple times. Particularly Oregon did that with playing tempo. I thought some of the play design was messed up by the tempo, which I think is why Denzel Burke had one of his worst games, and not just one of his worst game ever as a Buckeye. I think some of that was on him. I think some of that was actually on the tempo, mistiming some of the blitzes and simulated pressures that Ohio State was running. I think that was a game that I came away convinced that both those teams are they're at least 2 of the top 3 teams in the country, if not the top 2 teams in the country. I'm very curious about Texas, Georgia this week. But I do think that part of the struggle for Ohio State is the context, right? Because in a vacuum, that game was phenomenal. Like, I'm a Buckeye fan, but I was not super angry after that game, like a lot of people were. I thought it was an excellent game. I picked Oregon to win 34-31. I was 2 points off. If they don't miss the extra points, then I'm straight on. So thanks, Dan Lanning, for screwing up. Thanks to the kicker, I should say. But I thought Oregon had the advantage of the stadium, the home field advantage. I think the worst part about that game, though, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Ultimately, if not for the context of Ryan Day's past several years, I just come away and say that was 2 great teams, and somebody had to win, and the home team won. So, like, that's without context in a vacuum, that was my thought. However, there's context. Seeing them bungle the last few seconds, it just felt eerily similar. Felt eerily similar to Georgia. It felt similar to, I shouldn't say it felt similar to Ohio State, Michigan last year. They didn't struggle with time clock management. They just threw the pick at the wrong time, right? It showed up against Utah in the Rose Bowl. Ohio State consistently under Ryan Day has not been able to get the job done late. And even when they have, the Utah game being a prime example, they have not managed the time well. The defense has failed in all of their games against top 5 teams. They have not measured up. Remember, this is supposed to be a generational defense. Generational defenses don't allow 500 yards to anybody, including the best offenses. This is not a generational defense yet. And that was my concern. The things that I was concerned about in this game defensively were the things I've been concerned about for the past 3 years. Struggling to stop the run. Jordan James had over 100 yards. Struggling to get off the field on third down. They did not force a punt in the fourth quarter. Concerned that they couldn't get a pass rush. No sacks. That's where you're like, you guys know if you've listened to this show for the past 3 years, you know, I was saying, sometimes you are who you are. And I think I've been trying to think, because I think people give Ryan Day too much crap because he's a really good coach. But I thought about it. I was at the gym this morning. I was like, who does Ryan Day remind me of? And here's who he reminds me of. And please, before you criticize this comparison, hear me out. He's LeBron James. He's LeBron James. When has LeBron James won championships? When he had a stacked roster and they had an easy path to victory. And when they won game 7s, it was because he had somebody else to bail him out. But he had immense talent. He has immense talent. He is incredibly intelligent, right? Incredibly intelligent. I think Ryan Day is incredibly intelligent. I think he is one of the best recruiters in the country. I think he's a good X's and O's guy. I think he's got everything. But he ain't Michael Jordan. He does not have the clutch gene. And I think that's what we learned about Ryan Day. So do I think that he should be fired like some of my friends think? No. I don't think you fire him until, I don't even think you think about firing him until either A, he loses to Michigan again. And even then I'm like, I don't know about that. Or they go like, they have consecutive years where they win less than 9 games. 9 games or less, I should say. If you're winning 10 games, and I've said it with Nebraska, I've said it with other teams, be careful what you wish for. Because you lose Ryan Day, you probably lose all your infrastructure. Now it's Ohio State. I think they would be okay. They rebound. But just remember, if you're getting rid of Ryan Day, you are probably asking for a couple of mediocre seasons coming down the pike, especially with the new look Big Ten. Oregon was phenomenal in that game. They were so good. And we'll talk about this, my mid-season superlatives, if you will. Derek Harmon, that dude is a monster. That whole defense is really, really good. Mateo Uyunglele. Jabbar Muhammad, he's a shorter corner, but that dude's a stud. And then you look at the offense, Dillon Gabriel, I thought played the best game of his career. I mean, he was fantastic, just very efficient, hit downfield shots. I thought Evan Stewart really showed up in a big way. You know, people are roasting Denzel Burke, but let's not forget Evan Stewart proved that he is a primetime player, right? Jordan James was great in spots, tallied over 100 yards against a pretty darn good rush defense. Again, a rush defense that held Caleb Johnson to under 50 yards for the first 3 quarters. I mean, hats off to them. Like, seriously, I probably would have put them number 1 in the country this week. No offense to Texas, but I thought they proved that they were the best team in the country with this win. And they deserve all the accolades. I think they're going to be tested. We'll talk about this in midseason review portion, they will be tested having to go on the road over the next few weeks. That's maybe my biggest concern. One other note, and then I want to just talk about two other games real quick. One is the note here is that Ohio State's championship chances took a massive hit with losing Josh Simmons. And I don't know how they're going to replace him. And quite honestly, I'm nervous that they will not be able to adequately replace him. So that's something to keep an eye out. I want to briefly just talk about Penn State and USC. I think for Penn State, I expected a larger margin of victory and more domination. But it's a credit to James Franklin to go on the road, to have your quarterback not give his best in the first half, right? Threw 2 picks. He threw a third on a Hail Mary. That doesn't really count. But Drew Aller threw 2 picks. They didn't go away from him. Tyler Warren had a big day. Tight end receiving record at Penn State. I think 240 yards in that game. Just unbelievable performance by him. But seeing Drew Aller work it out, hit those 4th downs to Julian Fleming, which you got to love that for a guy who's battled and competed, for him to have those type of moments, especially earlier on when he had drops. For them to do that says something about the character of this Penn State team. It'll be easy to look at how they struggled and be like, oh, they're not a top quality team. That's what's been missing, is when Penn State has a stinker of a game, can they do enough to pull it out anyway? Now, do I want to see Penn State start fast? Yeah, I do. Do I want to see them blow teams out? Yeah, I do. But can Drew Aller build upon this? Absolutely. I think that's the biggest thing. You learn that your quarterback has developed into a gamer who no longer is afraid to throw deep passes, but will hit you over the top and is willing to do it. In a game where honestly they should have lost. And they battled back. They did a great job. Now, USC, they're 3-3. It's easy to think, ugh, lost season. And what I would just say is pump the brakes. I think USC just had a tough run where they had to play a better Minnesota squad than I think what was presented in week 1. They lost to a Michigan team that I think is hot and cold. And both those teams they lost on the road. And then I think they lost to a top 5 team in Penn State. That's who they lost to. They lost 2 games on the road. They lost to Penn State. And by the way, they beat a top 10 team in LSU, who I don't actually think is top 10. But they beat the frauds that are Ole Miss. So sure, they're ranked top 10 right now. But my point is, USC was always going to have probably a similar record to a year ago. But I think we would all say that they're probably better than a year ago. And so all this comparison about, Lincoln Riley, he's no better than Clay Helton. In fact, he's worse. Look at the records, yada, yada, yada. Okay, USC fans, if you're watching, hear me closely. The Big Ten's better than the Pac-12. They're far better. And you're playing better teams with better offensive lines for the most part. Don't be dumb. That's my message to you. Don't be dumb. Okay? If you thought USC was going to win the Big Ten this year, just eject that out of your minds. I know it probably felt even more that way when they beat LSU. And I've been telling you, since that game, they punched up and they outcoached Brian Kelly, which is not that hard to do, quite honestly. But it was impressive that they could beat LSU. I think they're going to go on a run here in the back half of the schedule. We'll talk about that in a minute. But don't get out the firing squad for Lincoln. Let him work this out. Let him gel with Danton Lynn. Let them recruit some of their guys on defense. Because I think they have the makings of a really good staff that could compete for the Big Ten in the next couple of years. But remember, really hard schedule. I believe Phil Steele had it as a top 5 most difficult schedule in the country preseason. I told you it was going to be rough. It's going to be fine. They're going to be fine. Like, they may not have the record you wanted this year. Just wait. Relax. It'll be okay. One last game, and it pains me to say this before I get to the midseason review. I feel awful for Rutgers because they have just had a slew of injuries. But the team I saw against Wisconsin was a shell of themselves. I'm not sure they get to a bowl game this year anymore. I think Kaliakmanis has underwhelmed. I think the injuries on the offensive line and on the defensive side of the ball, Sam Brown was just announced that he's out for the season. I just don't know what to think anymore. And so I'm not sure how good Wisconsin is, if I'm honest. Because Wisconsin has beat Purdue and they beat an undermanned Rutgers team. I think they lose to Northwestern this week. And like Northwestern, I think, is turning a corner. I think there's a lot of teams in the Big Ten that are turning a corner. But I think it was more that Rutgers was bad than Wisconsin was good. And I'm not trying to bag on Wisconsin or Rutgers. It's just Rutgers since Nebraska they looked shell-shocked. It feels like all the momentum has been sucked out. I thought I was watching a Chris Ash coached team, which was uncharacteristic with Greg Schiano, especially over the past couple of years. And I want to see how they come out against UCLA this week. I have UCLA winning that game because I think UCLA has fought harder, and I think they have less injuries right now. So I hope I'm wrong, but I'm very concerned. Like the receiving core, I think could be good, but drops have killed him. I think Kaliakmanis, he has no ability to navigate the pocket well. I shouldn't say none. That's a bit extreme. He is not very good at navigating the pocket. I feel like he's making similar mistakes to the ones he made at Minnesota. And with the offensive line, the way it's banged up, it's not creating running lanes for Monangai. It's not helping Kaliakmanis stay upright. And even just their situational awareness. I can't tell you how many times against Wisconsin, I was like, all right, you got to get 6, they get 5. All right, you got to get 5, you get 3.5. And it's like, man, you've got to know where the sticks are. And it was just poor execution. I don't know if that comes from coaching or whatnot, but after a really exciting start, I'm very, very concerned for Rutgers. And that's after me thinking they had a shot at 10 wins this year. We'll see. I'll get into it. Let me do score predictions real quick. I'll tell you, I'm just going to kind of run it down the list with a quick description. I've got Oregon beating Purdue 38-10. I think Oregon's going to be a little sluggish on a Friday night game. I don't think Purdue's going to give much resistance, but I also think Oregon's probably not going to run it up. And Oregon hasn't really scored over above the 30s, except I think for Oregon State. I think Purdue, their offensive output that they had last week against Illinois, I don't think that happens again. I think Oregon's defense is too strong. So I've got Oregon beating Purdue. I've got Nebraska falling to number 16, Indiana, 24-31. I think Nebraska is a good team, but I do think Raiola struggles with pressure. I think Cignetti's going to apply the pressure there. And I think Indiana's offense is a bit more tough and rugged than people want to give it credit for. They have a two-headed monster with Lawson and Ellison at running back. Rourke is poised. Their receiving core, they just love to fight. Elijah Surratt is awesome, by the way. So I've got Indiana 31, Nebraska 24. I do have Northwestern upsetting Wisconsin at home. I think if this were in Madison, I'd probably go Wisconsin, but Northwestern at home, I think one of the most underrated units in the Big Ten is the defensive line of the Wildcats. I think they go 8 deep or so. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. Oh my gosh, why can't I remember his name? Uh, I'm gonna look it up here, but they have a lot of guys on that defensive line that can disrupt. And as good as Wisconsin's offensive line has developed and helped Braden Locke, and as much as Tyree Walker has really stepped up, I don't think they've seen a defense like Northwestern's outside of maybe Alabama. And I think that's going to be tough. Anto Saka is the guy I'm thinking of. One of the best. Jr. mentioned this on the Big Ten Huddle. One of the best win rates out of any defensive lineman in the conference. So really, and he's a quote unquote backup. They rotate a lot of guys in there. I think that's going to be a tough ask, especially with the wind coming off the lake, with their stadium there. I just think David Braun gets it done against Wisconsin, despite the fact that Wisconsin's shown a bit more life here. I got UCLA traveling to Rutgers and beating them 28-17. I think the problem for Rutgers is I don't know how they score points right now. And I think the defense, I was looking at the rivals board for Rutgers. They think that they could be down 5 defensive starters on Saturday. And as bad as UCLA has been at times, TJ Harden, Sturdivant getting the ball from Garbers. I just don't know what happens if UCLA gets up 14-0. I think that becomes a pretty tough ask for Rutgers. So I've got USC traveling to Maryland, beating the Terps 45-20. I think Iowa cruises against Michigan State 37-13. And before you say you're expecting Iowa to score in the high 30s or 40s again, like, yes, because Michigan State has the rare combination of a turnover prone quarterback. And well, I shouldn't say rare combination. It's the rare combo of Iowa's defense being fantastic at turning you over and Michigan State being very good at turning the ball over. I think that's going to lead to some easy scores. I think Caleb Johnson has a day because that's what he does. 37-13. And then I think the game of the week outside of Nebraska, Indiana, I think that game's really good too. Number 24, Michigan, I have upsetting number 22, Illinois. I don't think it's actually an upset. I think Michigan is a favorite, but I think Michigan beats Illinois 27-24, close game. To me, it comes down to the running games. If you look at Illinois, their ability to stop the run, it has not been great. Against Kansas, they allowed 5.6 yards a carry. They only mustered 2.3, and that was with Caden Fagan. Fagan's probably out for this game. I think he is definitely out. I don't know the status on Xavier Scott. I think he'll play, but he was out last week. I think that's going to be the difference. I think Tuttle's going to start for Michigan. I think Michigan's going to – I think they're going to pound the rock, and I think they're going to get a close win and get Michigan back on track. If you're an Illinois fan, you are probably rejoicing that I picked Michigan right now. So I take all responsibility for Illinois' win if they do, in fact, win because I picked against them. Let's talk midseason review because I think this has been a fun season. I was doing the math. I've gotten 3 out of 18 teams 100% right, which I don't know if that's a good thing to admit on the podcast, but I've gotten 3 of 18 teams, their record completely right. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go team by team and kind of talk about where are they? Are they, are they exceeding expectations? Are they below expectations? Are they kind of right where we expected them? And then kind of what's the outlook for the rest of the season? So that's kind of what we're going to do. And then I'm going to do offensive player of the year so far, defensive player of the year, and freshman of the year, and then coach of the year. So that's what I'm going to do so far. So I'm just going to go alphabetical. All right, alphabetical. So Illinois, the team that rejoices every time I pick against them. I had them 3-3 up to this point with losses to Kansas, Nebraska, and Penn State. They're obviously 5-1. And I think there's some context here. One is good on them for going on the road to Nebraska to get that win. So that's one. Second, Kansas is not as good as we thought they were. And that's not to take anything away from Illinois, but it's to provide context. That being said, I had them finishing 5-7, not making a bowl game. If you look ahead, they're 5-1. They get Michigan at home. They go to Oregon. They get Minnesota at home. They get Michigan State at home, at Rutgers, at Northwestern. I think there's a legit shot with the way that they've been playing, the way that secondary flies around, the way that like their defense has really solidified. I know the second half against Purdue notwithstanding. I think you can make an argument that their ceiling is 10-2. Like, I know I just picked against them, but they can beat Michigan. They can certainly beat Michigan at home. I think they can beat Minnesota at home, although I think Minnesota is improving. I think they should beat Michigan State. I think, right, at least the way Rutgers is playing right now, they should be able to beat Rutgers. And I think that Northwestern game might be a toss-up at Northwestern, but I think Altmaier's the better quarterback. Jack Lausch is showing some stuff, but I think Illinois is in good position, not just to make a bowl game, but to make a good bowl game. I think the floor, and I think this is really stretching it, would be 7 wins, that they would go 2-4 the rest of the way. And I don't think I would pick 8-4 or 9-3 for Illinois right now, based on what I've seen. But I do think I want to caution Illinois fans. The Nebraska win's good, but remember, Nebraska could have beat you. Probably should have beat you. Kansas is ultimately turning out to not be a great win. But I think they've acquitted themselves well. I think they have a good defense. I think Altmaier, again, I think he's underrated. Their receiving core has been phenomenal. Franklin and Bryant, maybe the most underrated receiving core in the conference, if not the country. Really like what I see out of them. So I think if you're an Illini fan, you should be excited, but cautiously optimistic. Cautiously optimistic. You have exceeded expectations. Indiana, you have exceedingly exceeded expectations, right? So I had them at 4-2 at this point. They are clearly 6-0, right? I had them losing to UCLA, losing to Northwestern. Those are both on the road. I thought it's going to take some time for Indiana to gel. It did not take time for Indiana to gel. Now, cue the chorus of they haven't played anybody. I know. Go look at the scores. Go look at the film. They're dominating people, as good teams do. That's what I'm going to keep telling you. Good teams win. Great teams cover. I think that's the old Josh Pate-ism, right? So they're 6-0. I think they've covered every spread. They get Nebraska at home. I'm picking them to win that game. They get Washington at home. I think that might be the toughest game out of their next 4, depending on what Washington team shows up. At Michigan State, and then Michigan at home. Now, I'm curious to see what happens with Tuttle at quarterback. I think Michigan, from a talent perspective, is probably a little bit better than Washington, even though Washington beat them. But, like, I don't know if I'd pick this, but are we poised to see 10-0 Indiana before they go to Ohio State? I think it's possible. And then they get it's Ohio State. I think they lose to Ohio State, but then they get Purdue. Like, could they go 11-1? I think that's the ceiling, if I'm honest, is 11-1. Now, I think Washington in particular provides a very tough challenge for them. Tougher than Nebraska, because as good as Nebraska is, I think Raiola is certainly a fine quarterback who I think is developing. But, you know, his effectiveness really drops with the blitz. I think Nair and Banks, they're big receivers. I don't think they're great receivers. I know that might be controversial, but I don't think they're great. I think they're big. I think they're decent. I don't think they're great. I think Will Rogers with Jonah Coleman behind him, with Denzel Boston and Giles Jackson as his two main receivers, Latu as a tight end, I think it is. That's a tough ask for anybody. They are the most dangerous team, I think, from an offensive standpoint. The problem has not been their production. The problem has been the coaching and the lack of discipline. And so that's why which Washington shows up. Because if it's the Washington that showed up against Michigan, I think Washington probably beats Indiana. But if it's the Washington that shows up against Rutgers and shows up against Iowa, then I think Indiana wins. But the reality is Washington has to go on the road. They're not at home. So I like Indiana's. I'll say I like Indiana's chances to be 10-0 going into Ohio State. Now, I say that with a little trepidation because of Michigan. I think Michigan, I think, could kind of flip the switch. But I think there's a real possibility. I think the floor would be like 9-3. Like, I think they could lose to Nebraska. I think they could lose to Washington. Sorry, 8-4. But I don't think they're going to go 2-4 with losses to Nebraska, Washington, Michigan, and Ohio State. I don't think they'll do that. I think they will win at least one or two of those four and either get to 9-3 or 10-2. That would be my guess. With Iowa, I have them. I picked them to be 4-2 up to this point. I'm right about the 4-2, but I was wrong about one of the losses. I thought they'd lose to Minnesota. They creamed Minnesota, but they did lose to Iowa State, which actually might bode well for them in terms of the Big Ten race, because I think they're going to win out. They're at Michigan State, Northwestern at home, Wisconsin at home, at UCLA. Then they have an off week at Maryland, and then Nebraska at home. I think that's a tough, I think that the Nebraska game might be for a playoff spot. It might even be for a Big Ten championship spot. And I've been saying that since preseason that could be the case. But I just look at that schedule and I'm like, maybe Wisconsin could get them, but they're on the road. And again, I'm just not sure how real Wisconsin is yet. And I think, I like Iowa with Caleb Johnson better than everybody else on this schedule right now. So Iowa, I think they are meeting expectations for me. Maryland is below expectations, which is saying something because I had them at 5-7. I had them 5-1 going into their game against USC. They are not 5-1. They're 3-3 with losses to Michigan State, to Indiana, and to Northwestern, including the last one, which is a 27-point I want to say crushing, but the optics are worse than what actually happened. But you lose by 27 to Northwestern at home, by the way. You guys know how I feel about Mike Locksley. Below expectations, which is typically what happens with Maryland. The bar is set high and they are below expectations. And I don't think it's going to get much better for Maryland. USC at Minnesota, at Oregon, Rutgers, Iowa at home, and then finishing at Penn State. Where's the win? Maybe Rutgers? Maybe? But if Rutgers can get back on track, I don't think they win a single game. This could be a 3-win Maryland team. It is not looking good for the Terps. Michigan, I had them 5-1. They are 4-2 with a loss in conference to Washington. I only had them losing to Texas, but everything's still in front of them for Michigan, which I think people need to understand. They need to realize that. I think Michigan is in a place where I think they kind of want to be. Now, I have concerns about coaching. Defensive and offensive coordinators have left a lot to be desired. I think Sharon Moore's team management has left a lot to be desired. But they've faced adversity before. And the schedule, like, I think the floor could be 6-6, but I'll just be honest, and maybe this is me wearing my Ohio State my Ohio State colored glasses, and I say that as someone who sees Michigan as a threat always. I don't think it's out of the realm for them to go 10-2 and make the Big Ten championship. I think they beat Illinois this week. I think most likely they beat Michigan State. Oregon is coming to them. And remember, that'll be the third game in a stretch where they're traveling back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I think I don't know how they'll handle it. Remember, they haven't left the Pacific Coast at all this season. And now all of a sudden they got to do it twice in the span of 15 days. It's something to watch out for. And then they're at Indiana, which is obviously not a joke. But then they get Northwestern at Ohio State. So I think anything could happen. I think they could go 6-6. But I'm not gonna poo-poo the idea of them winning out, just because I've thought Michigan was out of it before. I thought they were a shell of themselves in 2021. I didn't think they'd do anything, and then they beat Ohio State. They get to the playoff. I didn't think Michigan would be good enough to overcome Ohio State in 2022, and they did. So I'm not counting Michigan out of anything yet. I would say they're slightly below expectations, but I'm curious to see what happens. Michigan State's exceeded expectations. I thought they would beat Boston College. They did not, but I didn't think they'd beat Maryland, and I thought they'd lose to Ohio State and Oregon. I think their line play has been a little bit better. I think their defense, Charles Brantley, man, great corner, great player. But you look at the rest of their schedule: Iowa at home, at Michigan, Indiana at home, and then at Illinois, Purdue at home, and Rutgers. I think my projection for them was 4-8. I think that's most likely the floor. I think that game at Purdue, or that game where they host Purdue, I think they win. But I could see 6-6. And man, what a boon would that be for Jonathan Smith in his first season for the Spartans. So I'm slightly above expectations here with a win in conference. Minnesota, slightly below expectations, but ascending. I had them at 5-2 at this point, with wins over North Carolina and Iowa and losses to Michigan and USC. They lost to North Carolina, they lost to Iowa, they lost to Michigan, and they beat USC. So slightly below expectations, but they are ascending. And I think Brosmer is starting to look like the guy we thought he would. I think the defense is starting to look better. Coy Parrish, oof, I love that man. 4 picks the past 2 games. Really, really good player. Really good freshman. And then you look at the schedule moving forward: Maryland at Illinois, at Rutgers, and then Penn State at Wisconsin. I think there's a ceiling maybe of 8-4. I could see them pulling off upsets against Illinois, and I could see them winning the Axe. Again, I'm not sure what to make of Wisconsin. I'm not sure what to make of Minnesota either, but I think they're tough. My one concern is their running game has really disappeared at times, but they're playing tough. I think they've rebounded quite well. And I don't like saying nice things about PJ Fleck, but I will. He's done a good job getting this team to rally after the first few weeks of the season. So good for them. Nebraska, I had it 6-0 at this point. I had them at 6-0. Obviously, they had the one stumble to Illinois by 3 in overtime. Their schedule the rest of the way at Indiana, at Ohio State, UCLA, at USC, Wisconsin, and at Iowa. I had them dropping, let's see, 3 of their last 6 games. And I think it's possible that they find a way actually to only lose 2. Because I think they, I have Indiana beating Nebraska, but I see a world where Nebraska can win that game. Like, I don't think it's definitely Indiana winning. I think I still have them beating USC at USC. I think they can beat Wisconsin. I think it's even possible they beat Iowa on the road. So, like, I think the only game where I'm like, I don't think they win is Ohio State. So, like, I think their ceiling realistically is 4-2 the rest of the way, which would get them at 9-3. So, like, I would say they're about at my expectations right now. My guess is 8-4 or 9-3 would be my guess for them. I had them at 9-3, so maybe slightly under, but I think Nebraska's doing well under head coach Matt Rule. Northwestern exceeding expectations. Now, they lost to Duke. That was sad. But I thought they were going to lose to Maryland, and they did not do that. So at this point, I had them. Let's see, where did I have them? Oh, and I had them beating Indiana too. So they're at 3-3. I had them at 4-2 in this point. So I would still say they're exceeding expectations, and here's why. I think they are better positioned to win games the way they're constructed than I thought they would be. I think Jack Lausch has really impressed. I think they've figured out the passing game with Kurtz, with AJ Henning. I think Cam Porter's going to come back healthy. I think that defense is going to give some teams problems. So I already said I think they're going to beat Wisconsin. I think they can beat Purdue. Now, I don't know if they go bowling, but I think 5-7 is on the table. I do think 6-6 is a slight possibility, right? But it's tough with at Iowa, at Michigan, Ohio State at home, and that's going to be neutral site at Wrigley Field, and then Illinois at home, which I believe is also going to be neutral site. I think it's a tough schedule, but I don't think it's out of their own possibility for them to get to a bowl game. I'd probably pick 5-7 or 4-8, but I still think for what we thought they would be, I think if they're 5-7 with an upset over Wisconsin, I think that's a pretty good year too under David Braun, if I'm being honest. Ohio State, I had them at 5-1. They're 5-1. This is one of the teams I got absolutely right, like 100% right. I don't think there's much to say. They're I'd say maybe slightly below expectations just because of the way they lost and with losing Josh Simmons. I think that's it. But like, again, you lost to maybe the best team in the country. So they obviously can beat everybody in front of them. Oregon. This is the second team that I had perfectly right. Wins against everybody. 6-0. They are exceeding expectations for me at this point, though, because of how they're doing it. I think they look fantastic. I think their defensive line, their offensive line has really gelled. I know I had concerns about them earlier in the season, but they are, I think, playing lights out right now. My concern is the travel. Again, I do have concerns about the travel. They go to Purdue. I think they take care of business there. Illinois comes to them. I think they take care of business there. But what happens then when you have to travel again across the country to Michigan, and then you come home, and then you have to travel again to Camp Randall, and then you come home? I don't think they lose 2 like I did preseason. I think they get into the Big Ten championship game. But it's just something to look out for. Like, that much travel in 4 weeks, and we've seen the statistic, it's a little overinflated, but teams that have to travel 2 or more time zones, it has not been great for teams. So I would just say, like, watch out for that. Just watch out for that. Obviously, they get Washington at home, and curious to see what happens in that game. Penn State exceeding expectations. I had them at 5-1. They are 6-0. My one loss for them was USC. They avoided the loss on the road, and they came back, and now they're on a bye week. I had them losing 2 more. Ohio State at home, and I had them losing at Purdue. They're not losing to Purdue. Not losing to Purdue. I refuse to believe that they will lose to Purdue. If they do, I'm not going to say that I'll do anything crazy like Florida State fans. But that might be the shock of the century if they lose to Purdue at this point. I think Wisconsin is a landmine, especially before Ohio State. But I don't think they go any worse than 11-1, if I'm honest. I think they might lose. I think if I had to guess, they'll lose to Ohio State, but I think that's going to be a really good game. I would not be surprised if Penn State gets the dub at home with the way Ohio State has been in big games recently. They're exceeding expectations. Purdue, they're Purdue. No offense. I'm sorry, but they're Purdue. This is a Purdue year. I thought they would be 2-4 at this point. They are 1-5. And aside from Illinois and obviously Indiana State, it's been pretty bad. It's been pretty abysmal. And it doesn't get much better. They get Oregon, and then they get Northwestern. I think they lose to Northwestern. They get Ohio State, LOL. They get Penn State, LOL. And then Michigan State, which maybe that's a chance for a win. And then at Indiana, I think, if I'm honest, I think they finish with 1 win. I think Ryan Walters is a bit in over his head. And I think there's going to be some decisions that have to be made at the end of the season. That's my guess. There was some life against Illinois. Ryan Walters was calling the plays, so maybe they turn it around. Maybe they get a win or 2. But I'm just not. I think that may have been more about Illinois letting up and Xavier Scott being out than anything else. So Rutgers, Rutgers at this point, I actually had 3-3, and they're 4-2. So surprisingly, I had them losing to Virginia Tech. They beat Virginia Tech, obviously. And then I had them losing to Nebraska and Wisconsin. They lost to Nebraska and Wisconsin. So on one hand, they're exceeding expectations, but the injuries just really concern me. They really concern me. So they go to UCLA, or they host UCLA. I'm nervous about that game. And then they go to USC. I think they lose that game. Then they get Minnesota, at Maryland, Illinois at home, and at Michigan State. I think preseason with fully healthy roster, I thought they would win 4 straight. I'm not so sure that that's going to happen. Now, I would not be shocked if they beat UCLA. I know I picked UCLA to win, but I wouldn't be shocked if they beat UCLA and get 5 wins. And then I do think they can get Maryland. I'll be honest. I think Minnesota and Illinois have improved, but they're not out of the realm of getting got by Rutgers if they play up to where I think they can play. But my concern really is the injuries. And so are they exceeding expectations? Kind of. But I also, the way that the league has shifted and the injuries, I am just very concerned. I think the floor is honestly 4-8, which is sad. I don't want that to happen. I do think there's a world where they can still get to 8-4, 9-3, because I think you can catch Illinois on a bad day. I think you can catch Minnesota on a bad day. Maryland's not good. Michigan State can throw you the ball several times and you can get out with a win. So I think they can do it. I just think it's going to be a lot harder than I think we thought in the offseason. And I would not be surprised if actually they lose every game after this because of the injuries. I'm not picking that. I'm just saying I think it could swing either way on that. UCLA, below expectations. Despite the fact that I'm picking them to beat Rutgers, below expectations. Now they've kept it close with some teams. They kept it close for a half against LSU, almost beat Minnesota at home, but I still don't think they make, outside of a Rutgers team that's been demoralized the past couple weeks, at least demoralized offensively and injured, I don't see another win on this schedule. So I shouldn't say below expectations because I had them 2-10. I'll say at expectations. I expected them to be bad, and they're bad. I do like how they're fighting, but they're not well coached. So they've got talent. They're just not well coached. USC, I had at 5-1. They are 3-3. So they're a bit below expectations. They're at 3-3. But I think what I would say is that they went on the road and played Minnesota, and I think we knew that would be a tough game. And I think Penn State's better than I expected. So again, context matters. The rest of the way, at Maryland, Rutgers, at Washington, Nebraska, at UCLA, Notre Dame. None of those teams are unbeatable for USC. So the ceiling's 9-3. And I include Notre Dame in that because I think Notre Dame obviously has the better running game, but they're getting hit with injuries left and right too. And it's at home for USC. So I wouldn't pick them to go undefeated the rest of the way. But I do think there's a world where they are, 8-4 or 9-3. I think the problem is, I think at Washington is going to be tough. I think Nebraska is going to be tough. And I do think Notre Dame is going to be tough. So I think 6-6, 7-5 is probably where you're looking for USC. And I would just say if you go 6-6 or 7-5 and you're mad at Lincoln Riley, just remember one of the hardest schedules, and it's kind of a rebuild from last year. You're rebuilding and reshaping the defense. So Washington, I had, I think 4-3 at this point, and they are 4-3 at this point. I had a win against Washington State and a loss to Michigan. Obviously, flip that. So they're coming off a bye at 4-3, and they actually have an extra conference win, which bodes well for them. At Indiana, USC, at Penn State, UCLA, and at Oregon. It's a tough stretch. It's a tough stretch for Washington. And I could see it where they don't go to a bowl game. Like, I think 5-7 is on the table because I think you could lose to Indiana, USC, Penn State, and Oregon. I could also see it where they're 9-3 because they have the firepower to compete with all those teams, including Penn State and including Oregon. The fact that it's at Penn State and at Oregon, though, makes me think that the ceiling is probably more like 7-5, which is what I had for them going into the season. But I had Indiana as more of a easier win. And I just don't, I think that's going to be a tough game for them. So I would say 6-6, 7-5 is probably where you're looking for Washington. I'd say maybe slightly below expectations, just the way I think they shot themselves in the foot against Washington State, and they certainly shot themselves in the foot against Rutgers. And it could cost them a bowl game. Wisconsin, they are the third team I got 100% right, but I'm below expectations on them. Part of that is the fact that Tyler Van Dyke is out, But part of it is I just don't know what to expect because they looked bad against Western Michigan and South Dakota. They got blown off the field at Alabama. They looked hapless in the second half against USC. But then they play a Purdue team that's bad, and they play a Rutgers team that looked hapless. And so I'm just not sure what to make of Wisconsin. Maybe they've turned the corner. I don't want to assume that they haven't. But this Northwestern game is going to tell us a lot. Their schedule moving forward: Northwestern, Penn State, at Iowa, Oregon, at Nebraska, and Minnesota. When I was picking this schedule, I had them winning 4 of 6, including Oregon and at Nebraska and home against Minnesota. I have a tough time thinking that they actually get that done. Like, I think Nebraska might challenge them just from a defensive standpoint. I think Oregon obviously challenges them, despite the fact that it's at home. I think Northwestern might get them. Right. I mean, I picked Northwestern. And Minnesota, Wisconsin, I think that game really is a toss-up. So I think their ceiling maybe is 7-5, 8-4, kind of what I expect. But I would change my pick prior to around 6-6. I think I would pick a 6-6, and I might still think that they're not going bowling this year, especially if they lose to Northwestern. Then I think the bowl game's in danger because of their schedule. So let me finish up with my superlatives. Most best offensive player, defensive player of the year, offensive player of the year, defensive player of the year, freshman of the year, coach of the year. I'll do the obvious one. Coach of the year is Curt Cignetti. No offense to Dan Lanning, who's really good at finding loopholes. Good job. Good job, buddy. But what Curt Cignetti has done in reshaping the culture of Indiana in just 6 weeks is phenomenal. And again, I know they haven't played anybody. I don't care, because you know who Indiana used to be? The team that everybody pointed to and say, we haven't played anybody. Like, that's how bad Indiana was. I'm trying to remember the statistic. I think it was the 1950s or 1960s is the last time Indiana started 6-0. I mean, what they're doing is remarkable. And I think he deserves all the credit. Going in the transfer portal, bringing in a good roster, but keeping some of the core of that roster intact has been huge for them. He is obviously the coach of the year. And I don't think it's close at this point. I think Brett Bielema, Dan Lanning, I think are two guys that certainly are in the conversation. But right now, I think it's Curt Cignetti and then a pretty big drop-off. Freshman of the year is a little different because there's a lot of good ones, right? Like Dylan Raiola, obviously, has been great for Nebraska. I think Coy Parrish, that dude, I could talk about Coy Parrish a lot, man. Really good safety. He's making a contribution on special teams. I think I am actually tempted to say him, but I will go with the obvious in Jeremiah Smith, the receiver for Ohio State, who seems to just put more highlights up every week for Ohio State. He's maybe the best receiver prospect I've ever seen. And he's a freshman. I mean, he's already being talked about as a Biletnikoff, potential Biletnikoff winner. And he's 6 games in, and I don't even think they've utilized him as much as they want to. So he is my pick, but I think there's a very strong argument for Coy Parrish, the way he's played for Minnesota. Defensive player of the year, there's a lot of good defensive players that we could pick from, right? The kind of the obvious one, with all the tackles and whatnot, is Jay Higgins. He has 62 tackles, 2 picks, 1 sack, just really, really good player. Xavier Scott for Illinois has had a great year with 3 picks, has a sack on the season. Coy Parrish, 4 interceptions at safety. I think you could make a case for him. Charles Brantley having a good year at defensive back for Michigan State. I think you could make a case for him. Miles Scott has had a good year. Sebastian Castro for Iowa, who's a good player. Flip Dixon for Rutgers. Jalen Reed having a good year, and obviously Deni Dennis Sutton and Zane Durant and Abdul Carter, like all those boys. I think you can make a case for Tyleik Williams at Ohio State, and Caleb Downs has been quiet, but he's been very good for them. My guy though is the guy who was a wrecker in the Ohio State game for the Ducks, and that is Derek Harmon. He has been, and I say this knowing that Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant are at Michigan, but Derek Harmon has been the most disruptive player for, I think, the best team in the country right now. I mean, he single-handedly stole a possession from Ohio State when he took a pretty good back in Quinshad Junkins and just ripped the ball out. It was a tackle for loss on that play, and it was a forced fumble and a fumble recovery, right? He has 3 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, 1 fumble recovery on the season, but he's not going to be he's not going to stuff the stat sheet because he's a defensive tackle. But my goodness, the transfer from Michigan State has been everything and more for that defense. And he stepped up. He and Mateo Uiagalelei, who I think also has a right to be on the short list for this award. But they did it without Jordan Burch, another guy who could be on the short list for this award. But I think Derek Harmon is the guy that has been the most impactful player on the best team. And that's where I'm gonna divert my my award for it. Last but not least, offensive player of the year so far. I think there's a lot of good candidates. Dylan Gabriel, obviously, right? I think you can make a really strong case for Curtis Rourke at Indiana, obviously. Like, I think those guys have been fantastic. Caleb Johnson at Iowa has been a stud. And I mean, you want to talk about just some of the, one of the best players, 12 touchdowns, 937 yards. I'm not sure anyone's running the ball better than him outside of Ashton Jeanty from Boise State. Just dynamic with the ball, and that's without a passing offense for the Hawkeyes. Like, he's just been so good. I think you can make a case for other guys like Ty Felton, 55 catches for 719 yards for Maryland. The receivers from Washington, Denzel Boston, Giles Jackson, have been great. So like, there's a lot of good arguments for a lot of people. I think, Will Rogers, I know you're going to evaluate wins, but he's been really good. But my guy is not a quarterback. It's not a running back. It's not a wide receiver. It is a tight end. Because Tyler Warren is a bad man. And he can do it all. He is tied for 6th for the most catches, or tied for 4th, with most catches. He is 6th for yards. Sorry, I got that wrong. He is tied for 5th for most receptions with 40. He is tied for 6th for most yards. And this is out of all pass catchers, not tight ends. 513 yards, 40 catches. He has 4 touchdowns. He also has 5 carries for 38 yards and a touchdown. He's 2 of 2 passing for 26 yards and a touchdown. And in their biggest game, he broke a freaking record of over 240 yards receiving. Like, he is the reason ultimately why Penn State was able to come back in that game against USC. One of the best athletes in all the Big Ten. And I know he probably won't win it at the end of the season, but man, I love this dude. And I think he has been the best player so far in the conference. And so Tyler Warren, my offensive player of the year so far. A lot of good candidates, but he is my main guy. I'll finish out with this. Who do I think the Big Ten? What do I think the Big Ten championship game is going to be? I think it's going to be a mess. I think it's going to be a mess to get there. But I think at the end of the day, I think Ohio State is better for having gotten some competition finally against Oregon. So I think one of the other reasons why I think Ohio State struggled a bit was twofold. One, they were away, they were on the road and didn't know how to deal with the environment. And I think that affected a lot, including communication. I think they'll be better prepared for that in Happy Valley. Two, that was the first time they played an opponent that was more than one dimension. So like Iowa is a better team, but they knew what to expect. Run. And that's all they had to game plan for. And everybody else, they might have had a two-dimensional attack, but it didn't matter because they just weren't as good. I think Ohio State went on the road, got tested, and was honestly a few yards away from kicking a field goal to win the game. And that's with a myriad of errors. So I think they end up running the table the rest of the way. I think Oregon is no worse than 11-1. I think it's very possible we have a really massive tiebreaker where you have a lot of one-loss teams in the Big Ten. Like I think Iowa could end up with one loss in conference. I think Indiana could end up with one loss in conference. I think Penn State could end up with one loss in conference. And I think it's very possible that Ohio State ends up with the tiebreaker over all of them because of head-to-head. And I think we get a rematch in Indy of Ohio State, Oregon. And I will say this, and I'll say it now. I'm going to put myself on the line here. I think Ohio State beats Oregon in the rematch. And I say that feeling very nervous. A, because I don't want to be seen as a homer, but B, I think it's going to be the game that finally turns the tide in the reputation of Ryan Day. I'm going to put that down on air so that in 8 weeks, if I'm wrong, y'all can laugh at me. Or I can say, hey, I believed in him. I think he's going to get it done. Because I think, once again, Oregon's going to have to travel and not Ohio State. And I think Ohio State, it'll be much more of an Ohio State crowd than Oregon because it's so close to their backyard. And if you think Ohio State fans won't make it to Indy, you are nuts. So I think Ohio State gets to Indy ultimately to rematch Oregon, and I think Ohio State will win that rematch. Thanks for listening. It's a longer episode today, but make sure you hit that like button, smash that subscribe button, share it with your friends, share on Twitter. And again, here's where you can find me. Sunday nights and Tuesday nights on the Big Ten Huddle. Monday nights, the call-in show for Ohio State for the Voice of College Football. And, of course, Thursday mornings. Stay locked in. Thank you all so much. Take care. God bless.